According to a recent survey by the National Autistic Society, significant factors of autistic well-being and quality of life are positive autism identity, being employed, autism acceptance and recognition of the role of autistic people in society, which is hardly surprising. Wouldn't anyone, autistic or not, list those same factors? And being employed encapsulates all these important factors. However, and I think this is a shocking statistic, autistic unemployment is the highest or second highest of all disability groups, alternating with unemployment in those with intellectual disabilities. Currently, only 16% of autistic people are in full-time employment, while 77% are unemployed, and most want to work. 58% among the unemployed want some help getting into employment but don't get any. The National Autistic Society survey found that when we asked about the single biggest thing that needed to change to help autistic people get into work, over 50% said support, understanding, or acceptance. As an article by the London School of Economics puts it, something is going seriously wrong in the workplace for autistic people to be so disproportionately unemployed. Unemployment is not only about getting a job. In my experience as an autist without intellectual disability, working with other autists without intellectual disability, the greater problem is not so much finding employment as surviving it. There should be plenty of time for questions at the end, but if you have a burning question that you feel absolutely can't wait, then feel free to ask during the presentation. You won't put me off. A wee introduction to me. I'm one of the few fully out autistic counsellors and psychotherapists in the UK. The result is that most, though not all, of my clients are also autistic. Although they are all very different ages, backgrounds, living circumstances, genders, sexualities, there are a few common themes. It will not surprise the autists among you to hear that one of the big ones is work. And as I've suggested, the problem is not so much finding employment as surviving it. Why is this? Well, I'll talk about my own experience first. I'm a pretty successful counsellor, senior accredited with the National Counselling Society, speaker, writer and facilitator. I have a first degree from Cambridge and a research degree from Oxford. I speak half a dozen languages, not all fluently, I will admit, and I can read a few more. School was a nightmare, but Cambridge was the ideal university for me. College rather than campus-based, with a lot of independent learning and plenty of fairly structured societies to join. I need hardly tell you that I instantly joined the anti-society and provided their Latin motto, which I probably can't repeat here. I also volunteered with the student nightline. It's strange to see how early in my life the seeds of the counsellor were sown. In Oxford, I volunteered with Samaritans. All this is really to demonstrate that, first, there is no way I would have got an autism diagnosis back then, although it's clear that my parents were concerned about something, including my terror of school, where I just about got by in most subjects, with spikes of brilliance at languages, though not unsurprisingly in oral exams, which are based entirely on small talk. And second, that by any reckoning I am, please don't ever use this phrase, high functioning. And yet. As Chris Bonello of Autistic Not Weird says, I am high functioning until I am not. The workplace proved to be a problem I could never solve, a code I could never crack, until right at the end of my employed life, I landed a 0-hours contract in the student counselling service at a university. Doing what I do best, working only the number of hours I could manage, no additional admin or responsibilities, in a friendly and supportive team who appreciated me exactly as I am. I prefer my current life as fully self-employed, but employed work doesn't get any better than that. Other workplaces could be like that too. Why aren't they? University has its own problems, but for me it was school that most foreshadowed the workplace, and the terror, confusion, and overwhelm reappeared. It is very dispiriting to be working at a job that is way below what one is capable of. At a certain point, I decided that doing a legal secretarial qualification might at least get me a secure job, as I had been working as an agency carer right at the bottom of the pile in care homes, and I never knew where the next shift was coming from. It was a terrible mistake. I sailed through the training with distinction, as I later did with a conveyancing paralegal course, but the jobs it landed me in were the very worst I could have chosen. This is the work-job distinction, of which you'll hear more about later. There was a particular combination of factors. Firstly, again, I was at the bottom of the pile. Secondly, I had higher qualifications than many of the people at the top of the pile, and they knew it and they didn't like it. And in many ways better skills, though obviously not in knowledge of the law. Yet I was treated as if I were fit for nothing better than audio typing and answering the phone. The phone, me. Thirdly, I was doing precisely the sort of things that I struggle with most: admin and juggling tasks. And of course, that phone. Don't ask me why, but in addition to that, I felt deeply ashamed to admit that I was a secretary, as I was never ashamed to admit that I was a care assistant. I think maybe it was the stereotypical image of the secretary that I'd been brought up with. I'm a child of the 60s. Over and over, I applied for the sort of jobs that I could actually have done well, all people related. And over, I was told I didn't have the experience or qualifications. I suspect also that the environment of the typical interview was the very last place in which my people skills could shine out. And over, I got, with no difficulty, the very jobs I was worst at, and which sent me into burnout. I was never bullied at school, or not by my fellow pupils. Staff, that was another matter. I always had a very small circle of very close friends, one of whom I'm still close friends with over half a century later, and we didn't really bother about anyone else. At university, I was in my element. But in the workplace, it became a recurring, almost daily experience. Why, I ask myself? What is it about us autists that makes us a target for bullies in one setting or another? And what can be done about it? First and most important, we are not the problem. We are not what needs to change. I have said this many times, and no doubt I will say it many times more. When a wheelchair user says, "I can't get up to the first floor unless you put in a lift or a ramp," you don't say, "But everyone says they love the stairs, and climbing stairs is really good for your cardiovascular system." Or worse, "Well, you'll just have to try, won't you?" But those two responses are exactly what people with invisible disabilities get. For us, the playing field is at a 45-degree angle. We aren't rubbish football players. We are playing against impossible odds. Another thing that is very important is that distinction between work and job. The work itself may be exactly what you want to do and what you are best at. The job, however, is the work plus the environment, and the environment may make that wonderful work into a nightmare job. One of my clients, Sandra, commented that she has never had any trouble getting jobs. The problem is that you can never tell from the job description what the job will actually be like. And Pippa said, "The work is fine. It's the peripherals that aren't." In what I call the job from hell, I was told I had to work in an open-plan office with humming fluorescent lights, no natural light, a radio permanently on in the background tuned to a local station, and one of those scented plug-ins to mask, I suppose, the scent of an unventilated room with all those people working in it. They didn't show me that room when I was interviewed in the plush front room of a very upmarket converted Edinburgh Newtown tenement. I said, sorry, I can't do that. They said I had to. I needed a job. I tried. They said I took too long making my coffee and I would have to drink instant. I tried but failed. Not because I think instant is beneath me. That was one source of bullying. But because the taste and the smell of instant coffee make me sick. As you may know, the autistic sensory experience and processing is different to the neurotypical, and we are often hypersensitive to sound, light, smell, and taste. That job, tick, 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 tick. And then the actual bullying started, which I need not go into. I lasted 3 months, and then after a complete shutdown during a disciplinary interview with HR, I resigned. I am not an anxious person. There's another autistic stereotype out of the window. But it shows the level of trauma that I experienced in that job, and I do not use the word trauma lightly. I am a trauma therapist. That I was unable to go into the building to pick up my things without my partner there literally holding my hand and doing all the talking. Without her, I would simply have left everything behind, including my phone, my glasses, my cafetiere, and the very expensive headphones that I had had to buy, because all they provided was earbuds, which I found too painful to wear. The job from hell was the best thing that ever happened to me. As I sometimes say to clients, you often look back at the worst time in your life and realize that that was the moment when you said, right, enough, and you started to turn your life around. It wasn't until a couple of jobs later that I said, aloud, nobody will ever bully me again, and nobody ever has. But that was the turning point. It was the turning point because it was the first time I actually understood that I was not the problem. The bullying was so blatant and outrageous, and the conditions so appalling, that even my entrenched narrative that I was difficult couldn't survive. After putting in my notice, I applied for a postgraduate diploma in counselling and psychotherapy and decided to go back to care work, as better at least than an office. I had done a certificate in counselling skills some years earlier and was volunteering with Cruse Bereavement Care Scotland, but had believed that there was no way I could afford to do the diploma. I certainly could never have afforded to do a degree. Well, for the 2 years of a full-time diploma, I fitted 13-hour day and night shifts around the training days and placement. It nearly killed me, but it was so worth it. Now, isn't this strange? A person who struggles in the workplace, but who can combine long shifts in a very person-oriented job with a very demanding course and placement, and survive, and eventually thrive. As Luke Bearden memorably puts it, autism plus environment equals outcome. And from that comes the shift from I have anxiety and depression to I am autistic. How would I expect to feel if I am trying desperately not to be myself? The feelings of anxious and depressed are simply pieces of information and guidance. Note that only one of my autistic clients and friends is employed full-time. Just one. And that is for the moment only, and because they perceive that they have no choice, as was the case with me years ago. And none of these people has any intellectual disability. I have been a full-time employee, but I have never lasted long. The longest full-time job I have had lasted 2 years. As a self-employed counsellor, I could easily have enough clients to be seen as working full-time, but I know I can't. The most I can manage in a day is 5, and that is exceptional. The norm is 4. That definitely does not translate into working half days, as there is all the case notes and admin and extras around it. But it still isn't quite 9 to 5 or equivalent 5 days a week. But it is my absolute limit. To misquote Pippa, the job, counselling, is demanding, but I love it. The peripherals, not so much. As a sideline to this, non-autists in the audience, don't push your autistic colleagues. They are probably already doing slightly more than they can sustain, however it looks to you. My client's experience is so similar, and so similar to my own, that I can pretty much sum it up in general terms without saying anything that would distinguish one from the other. But I will just say again that all the clients whose experience I have drawn upon have given express permission. Permission for quotations has been specifically given and the names have been changed. To return to this distinction between the work and the job, what did Pippa mean when she said, the work is fine, the peripherals aren't? What are the peripherals? Okay, here's my very incomplete list. Having to interact with people over the photocopier, in the kitchen, or by the coffee machine, at lunchtime, during breaks. Getting the tone of emails right, making sure one's facial expression and body language are doing what neuronormativity expects. Specifically in this regard, being forbidden to turn off one's camera or mute oneself during Zoom meetings, thus being unable to concentrate on the actual business of the meeting. Not stimming. The noise and the constant movement and snatches of conversation in the open plan office. The fear of looking up in case someone engages with you. Having to avoid the kitchen at lunchtime. Being forced to take your breaks at the same time as others. Being forced to drink instant coffee because making real coffee is seen as taking too long. Constant interruptions, constant changes in routine, unclear instructions. People not doing what they said they would. We do not have an entire day for this presentation, so you'll just have to take my word for it that it would take that long to describe all the peripherals that make enjoyable work into an unbearable job. Claire was working as a policy researcher and advisor. Her research and writing skills are first class. Her focus and exceptional memory allow her to locate, study in depth, find patterns in and draw conclusions from an extremely wide variety of sources and present them in a clear and succinct way. She'd do this presentation far better than me. In theory, her job could have been designed for her. In practice, the number of meetings, the amount of peopling, all the unwritten rules about communication, the inflexible hours, the neuronormativity. You will do things this way. You will behave in this way. Led to her being diagnosed with depression and anxiety. Is this becoming a theme? And taking repeated sick leave. Since her autism diagnosis and over a year of reflection, it is starting to seem at least plausible that she has neither. Maybe Claire was not depressed or anxious. Maybe she was trying to live in a world where she was constantly at sea and constantly getting things wrong. So constantly hypervigilant, anxious, and living with a constant feeling that she was inadequate and could do nothing to change that. Depression. We hang on to our jobs while spiraling down into depression, anxiety, exhaustion, burnout. Because we need the money, yes. But of all my clients and friends, only 2 have cited money reasons as the main reason why they battle to stay in work despite everything. We hang on because the message we have received all our lives is that we should work, and probably work 9 to 5. That if we don't work, we are lazy, worthless, all those words. And since we are likely to have been told we are lazy and difficult all our lives, because we struggle to do some of the so-called normal activities of daily life, that hits particularly hard. We hang on because otherwise what will we do? Claire's active, inquiring and tenacious mind, which she likens to a working sheepdog, needs something to chew on, something to chase down, something to organize and deliver. Otherwise, yes, depression. Have you ever seen a forcibly retired sheepdog? There is always the fear when considering whether or not to throw in the towel on employment, that if we don't have to go to work, and for some of us preferably outside our own house, we will descend into depression and doing nothing forever. We hang on because otherwise we feel we will lose what little structure we have in our lives. We hang on because we need other human beings. And because working leaves us so little energy, we likely have little or no other human contact. And we hang on because the alternative is the benefits system. While that is potentially surprisingly good if a person gets all the benefits they are entitled to, it is incredibly difficult for anyone, but especially for a person with poor executive function and different communication skills to navigate, especially if they are already in burnout. Most of us do not even allow ourselves to ask the question, can I continue to live in this way without destroying myself? Sandra says, telling me it's just a job is a complete misunderstanding. I am not putting more effort or importance into this job than it warrants. The problem is that if I am working, the rest of my life barely exists. I have to tell myself that it's important, because if it isn't, and if it is destroying my life, then what am I bothering to live for? And you need Claire's exceptional clarity of thought to make the essential shifts. The shift from the idea is to get gradually back to where I was before the burnout or breakdown, to the idea is to find out how, or indeed whether, the job and I are compatible. How or if I can do the job in a way that doesn't damage me. And then the shift to, if a dog tries to get through a cat flap, it will damage both the flap and itself. Maybe the job is cat-shaped and I am dog-shaped. And finally, I choose to leave this job, not because I can't do it, but because doing it in the way that seems to be required damages me, and I do not choose to be damaged. Claire left the job that she'd worked in for 25 years and which might have seemed ideal for her, not with a sense of failure, but with a sense of understanding both of the job and of herself, choosing to live her life as a successful dog, not as a failed cat. Now, that is a victory for Claire and for the rest of her life, but what a loss for the organisation. The more alert among you may have noted Sandra's comment. I have to tell myself that it is important, because if it isn't, and if it is destroying my life, then what am I bothering to live for? This is the effect on an autistic person of trying to survive in a non-autistic workplace with no adjustments. Sandra is not the only person I have known who has been driven to suicidal thoughts by that experience. Another client, Pippa, after a long time off sick with stress after serious workplace bullying, had been thinking quite hopefully of going back to work at the same organisation, with adjustments in place, and above all with the financial advantages. She dreamed of getting a piano, and she dreamed of being able to visit her friend in Estonia. But then she had a very enjoyable weekend with friends, and all that fell apart. Because maybe she could survive that job. But it would be only survival, and she didn't want to go on doing survival. Everything else would have to fall away, and she would be back just about managing, and almost never doing anything that actually makes her happy and contributes towards life. She said, I had almost forgotten that trees and water and laughing exist. She couldn't keep doing what she had been doing. First, it doesn't work, and second, it is not a way to live, and Pippa needs to live. Or she is at risk of deciding not to live. Pippa has been there once, and she is not going to go there again. I quote here a section of a letter I wrote for Pippa to explain why she was, at least in the current circumstances, unable to work. Now, this is an extremely capable woman with no intellectual disabilities, whom I have described as the Grand Master of camouflage. Part of the problem is that there is almost nothing Pippa can't do if she sets her mind to it. What people don't see is the price that she pays for the constant pushing on through and camouflaging. I listed the main origins of overwhelm, stress, and eventual burnout, and added, she uses all her energy in combating this overwhelm and camouflaging or masking at work, with the result that she becomes unable to function outside of work. For example, in the areas of self-care, ability to feed herself, ability to socialize, or even to reach out for help. Her quality of life deteriorates to the point at which her anxiety responses are extreme and suicidal ideation becomes constant and life-threatening. This permanent stress, anxiety, and burnout also leads to significant physical symptoms. Eventually, it becomes impossible for her to sustain the effort that it requires to cope with the issues mentioned above, and she has no choice but to take sick leave. On several occasions, she has returned to work too soon and has rapidly become unwell again. When she is well, not overwhelmed, not burnt out, and not requiring to mask, she can manage the essentials of life. When she is in the workplace, her capacities decline dramatically, and eventually she reaches the point where she is barely able to live independently. Well, Pippa is now rethinking her life in the light of her autism diagnosis, the fact that she has been autistic without knowing it all her life, and maybe, just maybe, that she is exactly the person she should be and that the future need not mirror the past. But it has been a long fight with no support, and it isn't over yet. You will have noticed that I said earlier, this is the effect on an autistic person of trying to survive in a non-autistic workplace with no adjustments. But surely it is a legal requirement under the Disability Act for a workplace to make reasonable adjustments. I'm afraid that if you use that phrase to most autists and to most people with invisible disabilities, and probably to many people with visible disabilities, the reaction will be anything from a hard, humourless laugh to tears. There are so many occupational health meetings, so many organisations that specialise in assessments, so many documents about reasonable adjustments, and yet so often nothing is ever actually put in place. Claire says, managing reasonable adjustments was the final killer for me. Working out what was reasonable at a time when there was so little precedent, being told that I was entitled to a set of adjustments and then them being inconsistently applied, feeling I was being perceived as unreasonable for wanting basic adjustments to be delivered. As Claire suggests, there are 3 stages: working out what is needed, the requests being accepted, and then the adjustments being put in place and kept in place. All 3 stages are extremely problematic. The first stage is a major hurdle. If you have an employee who uses a wheelchair, you pretty much know the basic adjustments. Indeed, many workplaces are already accessible to wheelchair users. You need ramps and lifts rather than stairs. You need wide doors which open automatically or at the push of a button. You need adapted desks. The basics are pretty obvious, and other necessary adjustments will become obvious with time. Again, with a visually impaired employee, the basic adjustments are well known: speech recognition software, braille texts, audio description. But in the case of autism, the adjustments are not obvious, and this is quite hard to express. You can't see them working in the same way as you can see a door automatically opening to let a wheelchair user pass through. That often used and more often misused phrase, when you've met one autistic person, you've met one autistic person, has a flip side. The adjustments Claire would have needed won't be precisely the same as the adjustments Pippa would have needed. There are characteristics that most autists share, but because we are different people, they will manifest differently. Here are the main ones, with brief indications as to how they may be problematic in a non-autistic environment. They are mostly not what you will find in any diagnostic manual. I have touched on sensory sensitivities above. They are, I'd say, universal. Is it so hard to turn off the radio, to replace the flickering fluorescent bulbs with LED ones which mimic natural light, to replace ticking clocks with silent ones, to ask people not to eat food in the work area, or even not to wear scent or aftershave? We also have different communication styles. We don't have deficiencies in social communication. We simply do not have neurotypical communication styles. Anna, who works in care, says, social norms are totally confusing because it feels like they're different in different workplaces or in the same workplace over time as staff change. So if I ever feel I've found a way to more or less cope, it probably then changes again. Service users were never a problem. They and I got along brilliantly. It was just the other staff I was baffled by. We realize we don't naturally understand non-autists, and so we study them and maybe mimic them all our lives. I always say that one of my big strengths as a counsellor is that I don't assume, because experience has told me I can't. With autistic people, well, maybe I could, but it is still much better to listen to your client with what Fritz Perls called creative indifference. But non-autists often do not realize that they don't understand us, and they interpret what we say and do, and the way in which we say and do it, as if it were themselves, with the result that they think we are rude, bored, lazy, insubordinate, don't care, and so on and so forth, none of which are necessarily true. If we know what people mean, if we know that they say what they mean and mean what they say, a huge amount of stress just falls away. If a manager says, there will be a meeting about X at 2 p.m., we expect there to be a meeting about X at 2 p.m. Apparently, that isn't always the case. It should be. We mostly don't have all that much problem with change, as long as we can see the reason for it. But things that don't make sense, no. I'm a very typical autist in that I cannot remember things that don't make sense. I cannot repeat something I don't understand, and I cannot carry out a process that I don't understand. I was constantly in hot water in school and in the workplace for repeatedly saying, I don't understand, and consistently getting things wrong until I did, which in some cases was never. That was what got me disciplined in the job from hell. If any of you have heard of Damien Milton's double empathy theory, that's what it's based on. Different communication styles stem from different cognitive and processing styles. I won't go into the details of autistic processing style, but briefly, we seem to lack a brain filter and are very quickly overwhelmed, whether with sensory things or with information. We also tend to process more slowly, some of us would add, and more thoroughly, and to focus on one thing at a time. Dinah Murray has called this monotropism. The effect of this is that we are often not good at juggling tasks, at admin, at tasks with many steps, or anything where there is just too much coming in. We may become confused or completely overwhelmed. Although most of us have exceptionally good memories, our short-term working memory is actually often very poor, which doesn't help. We are also inclined to see the detail rather than the whole, which can mean, for example, that we don't see where our particular task fits in the whole project, and we can make mistakes that to a person who tends to see the whole seems slapdash or stupid. It can also mean that when we are under stress and someone is talking at us and either giving too much information or asking too many questions, we may be literally unable to speak. This is known as situational mutism. That happened to me at that disciplinary at the job from hell, which only increased the fury of HR. Two other important points are our spiky profile and the fact that we mask or camouflage almost all the time. I mentioned the spiky profile when I talked about my experience at school, and it is the origin of many a misjudgment. In autists, the difference between strengths and weaknesses is significantly more pronounced than for neurotypical people, who tend to have a more uniform profile of skills. So with a neurotypical person, generally speaking, you can guess their ability in X from their ability in Y. That is much less likely to be true for an autist. So we very frequently hear, you can do Y, why can't you do X? Again, people may assume we are lazy, aren't trying, can't be bothered. All that, wrongly. And finally, masking or camouflaging. When I was talking about Pippa, the grandmaster of camouflage, I said part of the problem is that there is almost nothing Pippa can't do if she sets her mind to it. What people don't see is the price that she pays for the constant pushing on through and camouflaging. Camouflaging or masking is hiding our autism, trying to appear as neurotypical as possible. That extends not only to imitating neurotypical behavior and language, but also to covering up our struggles, pretending to understand, pretending not to mind, pretending not to be sensorily and cognitively overwhelmed. It is a major factor in the disproportionately high levels of suicidality among so-called high-functioning autists. The most important thing for an employer to do is listen to their autistic employee, telling them what is and what is not a problem in the job. And then to work out with the employee and maybe with HR, occupational health, or even an external organization, how the employee might do the work differently, in a way that is less stressful and therefore more efficient. That flexibility about how the work is done could benefit everyone. Autistic traits are human traits. Autists may not be the only ones who would benefit from clear instructions, consistency, better lighting and decent headphones, and the acceptance that we are all different. The problem is, of course, that we autists first have to accept that our needs are valid. And since we have almost all spent our lives thinking that how we are is wrong, and we should be able to do things in the way this neurotypical world does them, that is quite a big ask. People have always seen our outside, and because we have been given their narrative, which doesn't fit our inside, we have self-invalidated for so long that we can barely see that inside. We find ourselves gaslighting ourselves. That's where therapists come in. By empathy, congruence, and unconditional positive regard, honestly, you don't need any more than that. You help your autistic client to see that the self they truly are is exactly the self they should be. From there, it becomes possible to identify what their valid needs are. And even once one accepts that one's needs are valid and has identified what they are, self-advocacy is exhausting and confusing. I think most people find it much easier to advocate for someone else or for a group than for themselves. So bear in mind that that is yet another burden on the already overburdened system of an autist in the workplace. All diagnosed autists have had the extremely painful experience of seeing ourselves presented in a pathologized way. During the diagnostic process, everything we do, say, or experience, every detail of our processing system, internal and external, is framed in terms of deficiency and problem. Problems, be it noted, largely to others rather than to ourselves. We as humans are presented as lacking, as deficient, as disordered, as problematic. That was the diagnostic process. That was our experience at school. And now it is our experience at work, with or without some bullying thrown in. Our way is the wrong way, as it was, is, and evermore shall be, unto the ages of ages. Amen. Reaching the point where we can say, I am not the problem, is monumental. So we ask for reasonable adjustments. And again, what we find is that those reasonable adjustments are framed in terms of what we cannot do. Less. You are less capable. You can do less. That is extremely ableist and negative. It is also inaccurate. More accurate and more healthy is to frame them as different. Your strengths lie elsewhere. You are better doing it differently. Not you can't manage more than 3 meetings a day, but which meetings are actually important? You're good at meetings. Do this one crucial one. Don't waste your talents and time on all the routine ones. We may need to work a shorter day, but because of our exceptional focus, we can probably do in 5 hours what a less focused non-autist would do in 8. We may be unable to take in information or training orally, and almost certainly we won't in a meeting or group, but our exceptional memory probably means that we can memorize the handbook. We may learn absolutely nothing from the sociable, outgoing buddy, but a quieter buddy who actually knows her stuff and will answer our actual questions may make all the difference. We may have no clue how to write a nice sociable email, but the emails we do write will leave our staff in no doubt as to what needs done and what the plan is for doing it. We may take longer to check over a piece of work, but you may be sure that when we've finished, its spelling, punctuation, and grammar, or its coding, will be flawless. Since I'm not talking to employers here, this isn't the place to go into details about reasonable adjustments. And as therapists, it is probably better simply to listen to your autistic client and work out with them what it is they need in the job that they are in. Always remembering that the first task, and almost certainly the most difficult, is recognizing and fully internalizing one's own validity and the validity of one's needs. So one of the most important reasonable adjustments is training. Not training of us, training of the others. Proper training. Training ideally by autists, or at least by neurodivergent people, but not by the poor autist who is trying to survive in that organization. And training for the management, HR, occupational health, and all staff. And finally, those adjustments have to be put in place and kept in place consistently. Otherwise, the cycle of burnout and return will continue until one side or the other gives up on it. As my client Bria put it, my autism isn't going to change, so something else will have to change if you want a different outcome. Autism plus environment equals outcome.